Hi, my name is Victoria, and this is my Human Development and Learning Prezi presentation for EDFD 400. I will be talking about the things that I had learned in this class, how we learn, just the different strategies of learning, and how I can really apply this to my own classroom one day. So the first thing that we had talked about in class specifically was how do you know you've learned something? Um, and that was something that was honestly really, really hard to try to even just put into words. And I think something that many of us had looked at were physical things in front of us that we had learned from, just like behaviorist, which I will also talk about. So, but first I'm going to talk about what Plato believed and how he believed that we had learned things specifically. So, first Plato talks about prior knowledge, and he believed that we either knew something or we did not. We were either born with it or we were not, and that we all have different experiences of how we understand something based on our past experiences, based on the things that are surrounding us. And that from this, we need to understand, I believe, that our students are all going to have different perspectives, and their learning experiences are already going to affect what they do know. So that's just something to keep in mind. Plato had talked about a story and believed in something called the myth of and the forgetful river, which was a story about a warrior named who died. And in that story, realized that when he was gone, what would happen to his soul. He believed that when this guy was to travel into this next world, depending on how much he drank out of the river, would say how much he remembered or he did not. And so it kind of made, I guess you're thinking about like the reason we're here is he believed that because we once had a life before, or that we'll have a life after this, and depending on if we drink a lot of the water, we're not going to remember anything from the life before coming to our new lives. Or if we drank a little bit of it, we would remember a little bit of information, and that's how Plato believed, whether we knew prior knowledge coming into this world or not. He also talked about something called the allegory of the cave. And this is something that I honestly found kind of interesting, very interesting actually. And it was a story about three men who were jailed in the cave. And there were other people outside, and they were trapped to all these ideas of these hallucinations that they were seeing. And one of them, hallucinations and shadows. One of these cavemen, I guess you could call him, was set free, and his eyes had been opened to the world. And so it's this idea that you can try to explain things to people, but they won't necessarily understand. And that's what happened with him when he came back to try to tell his other friends about what he was learning. But he wasn't, once he had learned more things, he wasn't able to see things the way that he used to, because that knowledge was continually growing. Something that this kind of makes you think of, though, is it makes you wonder, can we be confident in what we know? Is what we know the correct way? Is there only one way of doing something? And I think that's what we also have to keep in mind for our students one day when we're teaching, is that there's not just one correct way of doing something, but sometimes reality is different than we perceive. For example, there was a recording that we had listened to in class, which I cannot really remember what it was called at the moment. But I do remember the guy's name was Barry, I believe. And he continually was being taught to try shooting the basketball differently, and nobody wanted to shoot like he was doing. But in reality, his accuracy was a lot better. And so it kind of makes you wonder, referring back to the story of the guys in the cave, um, if you think of it in scenario is, are the people who are in the caves way better, or the people on the outside way better, true and correct? Um, and so what the allegory, just some takeaway points of the allegory of the cave teaches us is that sometimes the pressures of others makes us believe things that could be better, but then they may not actually help you. Um, we don't need approval of others to do what we think is right. Sometimes there's more than one right way of doing something. We're going to have students who have beliefs that they think are more important, which is something I believe you have to be very, very careful of. When I read that, I think of things like um, bringing faith into a classroom, or bringing political things into a classroom, or bringing things like media, society, LGBT. There's so many different things that we have to be careful of, but also allow students to come in and bring in who they are as they are finding themselves. And then, because we may not always be right, and they may have something to teach us. And my last one is, wrong answers don't necessarily mean poor academic scores. And so that's more so referring to, for example, if students are taking a spelling test and they spell something wrong, it doesn't mean that they're doing it incorrectly. It just means that it's going to show you what you can do to help them better learn. And to better learn and, I'm trying to think of the wording, achieve that skill. So this is more of what I had just kind of on these slides as a recap. We all have different understandings from past experiences, talking about the story of her and who he was, and then the allegory of the cave. And if you click on this video, there's actually a video that, so I don't have it in PowerPoint mode right now, so I could record this. But while this PowerPoint is actually going, you can click on this video and be able to recap on the story and talk about it. And so these are the three men, and this man in the middle was the one that was let go. And the final thing that Plato really looked at was, I think this was Plato, I don't remember if this was an actual person or not, but the tabula rasa was this whole idea of, it was opposite of Plato, was this idea of a blank slate, that we come into this world with no knowledge, and that we use our five senses to try to figure out the world and figure out our surroundings. For example, when a baby is born, they immediately start to learn their mother's voice and their touch and those kind of things. Alright, so going into this, like I had said before, we were trying to learn about how we know we had learned something, and many of us had it referred to objects, where Plato referred to us learning something with what we were coming into the world with, or tabula rasa talks about how we had no knowledge and we had to build off of that. Well, behaviorists believed that, so the behaviorism theory, it says our behavior can be explained through conditioning. Behaviorists do not look at thoughts or feelings of people. So they are not looking internally, like psychologically, but they are more so just observing conditions, and which they believe help alter behavior patterns. Um, and so they're observing behaviors to see how can I help my students, how can I help these people around me. They do not look at how people learn like constructivists do. Instead, they study those behaviors. Behaviorists um, really looked at our stimulus response theories instead when observing how we learned. So it was uh, taking something like, so we're going to talk about the different kinds of behavior theories like classical conditioning and operant conditioning, and it was seeing what triggered something else to happen, basically. And I'll kind of explain more into that. But first, I want to explain the stimulus is something that causes a change or reaction. So something is coming up, causing something else to happen or trigger in our minds. And a response is obviously how we react to this situation. And behaviorists looked at these situations and based everything on psychological responses and how are people responding. So one of the behaviorist theories that I had said that we were going to talk about was a classical conditioning theory, which was a study by Ivan Pavlov. He did a study with dogs, and honestly, the reason that he had started the study was because he had noticed the salivation in the dogs, and he wanted to kind of figure out what was going on with that. And so the different stages of this classical theory conditioning were that when this dog smelled the meat or he had seen the meat, he immediately started to salivate. And Pavlov he started using a bell to try to condition the dog to get to a point where the bell caused the dog to salivate, and the bell is what taught the dog that this was going to happen. So an example of this that I believe that we could use in our classroom is when you have a signal. I have had professors and teachers in my past where, and something that I honestly would love to use is they have a bell. And this bell, they would basically teach us that when they ring the bell, it means it's time to be quiet because we're ready to talk about what our groups discuss, or it's time to get class started. So that's just kind of an example of classical conditioning. And so the final response, like I said, of that, it started with meat to salvation, from the bell to no response, and then it was the bell and the food to salivation, and the dog had started to notice that, oh, there was a bell involved with food, and it's just the bell, he knew that food was going to be coming. The next one was by Skinner, which was also a behaviorist. Skinner and Thorndike. So Thorndike believed he had a law where he believed whatever the response, he believed that to change the law of response, that we had to change the law of response to whatever the stimulus was. So instead of it being a stimulus response like in classical conditioning, he was using response to stimulus. And he believed that they learned from that through consequences. So, for example, one of the studies that he had done was two studies he did were on cats and birds. And the cats had to figure out how to get out of the cages. The birds how to learn how to get food by doing some action, whether it was spinning in a circle, pecking at a board. Um, it's not necessarily that they could read, but they were able to figure out when they saw this image or they saw this word that, oh, I have to do this because I'm gonna get food. And so we can also incorporate those into our classrooms. Of a lot of times children will think that, oh, if I bring my homework back, then I'm gonna get a piece of candy today. And so we can use that to kind of help reward our students. But I feel like that could, for me, it would be challenging. I'd probably prefer to help them come to more of an expectation, like in classical conditioning. Thorndike believed that the reason he did this study was because he believed the animals learned like us humans through trial and error, and that they had to practice to get better, which I have seen so often at schools, and I've even seen myself, is that just like my choir teacher in high school used to tell us, practice makes permanent. The more that we do something, the better that we'll get at something, the further that we will go and what we want. And so this goes kind of back to a point where I had talked about kids are bringing in homework and we're rewarding them with a treat. And so that is a system of motivation that we can use for our students. But I think a big takeaway from Skinner's studies is that our students' behaviors can be shaped by controlling their environment or the actions through reinforcements. And different kinds of reinforcements are positive reinforcement, negative reinforcement, positive punishment, and negative punishment. Some examples of those are, for positive punishment is if I'm driving to work and I get pulled over, I'm getting a speeding ticket, and that kind of reinforces to me that I shouldn't be speeding. I need to be careful on the road. Positive reinforcement would be complimenting a child's behavior, and really just encouraging that. And I think that's something that we should be using quite a bit in a classroom, is positive reinforcement. I don't really like the word punishment, but I feel like positive punishment could be something to help as well. Negative punishment would be having your allowance taken away. A lot of times in school growing up, people take away recess, which I don't think should happen. I think that children need to be able to have that to continue learning. That's kind of a negative punishment. And then negative reinforcement is when we increase behavior, whereas with punishment, you're decreasing behavior. So an example of that would be putting on your seatbelt because your car keeps beeping at you to put it on. So far we have learned and talked about classical theorists who focus on passive learning and conditioning. We have focused on learning about the brain and how the brain is shaped and functions. And so what we've talked about is more of passive learning, which is students are expected to retain what is being taught and what is going on, and that information only gets so far though, so that can be a problem. So for example, if we are sitting and we are lecturing our students and there's not any engaging hands-on work, this can be an issue. So constructivism is more of active learning process where behaviors like Dewey believed that children should be learning from hands-on experiences. He believed that when you put manipulatives in front of children and you allowed them to problem solve, they better learned things. I don't know how to word that, but they're better learning situations, better learning things. And he believed that children learned by doing and by being actively involved. So children learn through physical activity and working with hands-on objects, which I think really correlates back to how many of us had said that we learn things. We learn through hands-on things. We learn through reading. We learn through writing things down. We learn through using math manipulatives on a table, or using little manipulatives in reading to help us sound out our letters and figure out which letters they are. We learn when we're engaged in material and studying, and studying. And so constructivists made many observations, and it really focused on observations and scientific study about people's individual experience and how we learn. So how our boys or girls coming into our classroom will learn, and then they will further reflect on those things and kind of looking at how they learned what they didn't learn. As teachers, in order to learn about our students' experiences, we need to be observing them through constructivism. We need to watch the experiences that are happening in the classroom. So an example of that is the Kohler study. And the Kohler study was the study on an ape named Sultan that we had watched in class, where he literally sat and had to figure out how he was going to get bananas with 2 sticks, which he ended up putting together. Or we watched another video about children who had seen that there was a need to be met. And I think a big thing about Dewey is that he realized that when children see a need and a problem solving situation, they want to get involved. They want to get involved. But hands-on learning is not the only way that we as teachers can be paying attention to our students. We can learn through them through emotional reactions. How are they responding to specific situations? We can learn through interactions of reciprocity, empathy, cooperation, and other interactions and reflective processes with those students. So this is, in other words, talking about the pillars of morality. And reciprocity, as I had mentioned, is this idea of fairness. It's a practice of exchanging things with others for our mutual benefit. What do you want to get out of it? But what are you also exchanging? And so often we will see kids who are they want to get things, though maybe they'll want to do something to get a piece of candy from somebody. But a lot of times once they've gotten that in teamwork, they may not always work with the other person. But to be fair, they will continue helping. I guess something I kind of think of is a kickball team I'm not sure this really goes with, but I think of kickball teams in our gym class that we would have growing up, and it really teaching the kids to work together and to be fair with each other on the team because they all want to play. Another way we respond, and we'll see children respond in our classrooms, is through empathy. When an example of this that I had seen in my clinical experiences this semester so far was there was a child that had gotten hurt, and all of the children wanted to surround that one child to make sure that they were okay. The class was very knit together, and they're kind of like a little family. So that is just one way of empathy that we can see it, and that's actually an example of consolation when the children are coming to meet the needs of each other. Another one is synchronization, so things that are happening in unison or together. For example, if you're yawning, you'll cause somebody else to yawn, just psychological. And the final one that I had brought up that we need to really learn to pay attention to in emotional reaction and interactions um, is, are we treating our students fairly? I have other slides here, sorry. So I had talked about Sultan, the kids, pillars of morality. This is an example of consolation, just like the children in the classroom. And fairness. Are we treating our students fair? As a teacher with multiple students, I know I grew up in a classroom with 30 kids. It can be really hard to make sure sometimes that you're giving the attention, the individual attention needed to students. And each student is going to want that individual attention. But we also need to pay attention to how these kids are behaving, because if they start acting out, if they start shutting down or not really wanting to interact, it may be because of something that we are displaying in the classroom. Because at this age, all children are very me. They want attention. They want to tell their friends about what's going on. And in order to get our students to cooperate, we need to make sure that the fairness in the classroom is being equally distributed. But another thing I think that is really good to hang on to is that depending on your students, fairness is not going to be equal to everybody. Fairness will be meeting your students where they need to be met. It will be helping them as much as they need to be helped. And that can be different for each individual student. So just a recap of, for just the teaching perspective of these different pillars, learning about the pillars of morality will help us learn how to perceive our students when something is going on in the classroom, because children learn empathy and display it as we do. So we can look at this and we can say, okay, how did I experience this as a child? How could I still experience this? Another one is that teaching is not going to be easy, and we will not always have students that will want to cooperate. So we're going to have to find ways to continue to engage our students and help students when they already have accomplished a learning target. That specifically there just kind of explains that sometimes fair is not always fair to students, but fair is meeting those needs of each and every student, which can be a challenge. So another thing that we talked about in class was something called the Gestalt theory, which was this idea of having an aha moment, that aha moment that helped you mentally grasp the meaning of something, that helped you understand what was going on. And it's our job as teachers to figure out how to help our students find their aha moment in learning. So, for example, going back to learning about funds of knowledge this semester, we may have to find something of their interest, something of their funds of knowledge that will help them find an aha moment, because our students are all going to be at different levels. So an example of this is that everybody will have different learning experiences and may see things differently, but we need to keep that in mind. If you remember back in class, we all did what was called was a Rocky prompt, but there was no title on it. We didn't know what it was necessarily about, and there I specifically remember 3 different stories or ideas being put on the whiteboard. And that just shows us that we all are going to learn from different experiences. We're all going to take different things away from that. So, how do we know when our students have that aha moment in their learning experiences? And how are we supposed to meet each student's needs if what they are receiving are different aha moments? We can use things like differentiation. But we also need to provide things like hands-on manipulatives that will reinforce student skills in learning to explain, predict, control, or adjust to our students' learning. These measures will help us as teachers to understand whether a student has learned something or not. And a couple takeaways that I want to just get from the Gestalt moment is that we need to allow children to do things so that they can learn. Children can do things, but as teachers, if we're doing everything for them, then there's something wrong with that. We have to allow them to do things on their own to some degree so that they can learn, because how are we going to know if they're learning if we're constantly giving them the answer to something, if we're constantly being the ones to explain what a word is? And I think there is a differentiation and a discernment in figuring that out. As teachers, we need to be providing hands-on manipulatives to learn from for our students to better give us evidence of what will help them. And we need to be aware when our students are feeling left out. We need to be aware of that inclusion. Because some students may act out, some may not want to listen or try and get your attention because they feel left out. And I feel like that's one thing we think of a lot. But some students may totally shut down, may not say anything, and may be very, very quiet about it as well. All right, so as we are learning, we know that we're using our prior knowledge and collection of data and different operations that we've learned to do new procedures, but we are learning using different interrelated and organized ways to learn different processes of specific tasks, and we're making decisions relying back to the prior knowledge that we have previously learned, whether it be through school, through at-home experiences, or something else. But we're also using something called equilibration. And equilibration is essentially a cognitive balance. So we're using equilibration and assimilation to decide on whether we're going. It helps us decide on whether we're going to do something or not. So, because equilibration, I said, is essentially a cognitive balance, which means it's an understanding of the familiar things. Where disequilibration is the exact opposite of that. It's something that you do not necessarily understand, something you're not familiar with. Assimilation is another, it's a subcategory. Assimilation and accommodation are subcategories of equilibration that help us understand these familiar things. And so assimilation is how we decide whether to assimilate or accommodate through something, which means that we will only adapt things that are valuable or important to our lives, where actually that is accommodation. So, yep, we're using things that are valuable to us and we're going to adapt them to us. Where assimilation is using our cognitive structures to make sense of our world and make sense of what is going on and how we can fit new information into what we already know. So combination is allowing change, adapting, and assimilation is making sense of something. So for example of a combination, we don't like to necessarily admit when we're wrong in a class. And so we'll generally we'll sit quietly. And I think this is something where it's really important as teachers to make sure that we're putting out, I guess you could say, surveys or putting people into smaller groups, because I personally found that you get more out of situations, more from people. Yeah. So we are going to move on to the subject of inquiring organism. And we've talked quite a bit already about this idea that do we believe that children need to be able to have hands-on things? Do we believe that we need to teach children in a present perspective and teach them with manipulatives, to provide practical application and hands-on activity? He believed if knowledge that was being taught wasn't going to help you, then what was the point of learning it? And so Dewey had realized and acknowledged that children's interest, conversation, communication, inquiry, construction, investigation, expression, experience, and then artistic expression helped them learn. And it helped these children learn through impulse, which is, it allowed them to have an interest in their learning. And a key note to kind of just hang on to about this is that when children are actively involved and they feel situations arise, they're going to want to help. And when children try to solve problems, they draw on their prior knowledge to try to help them learn skills, but it's also our jobs as teachers to come alongside of them and help them, because we cannot just expect them to know how to do something. So going kind of from a different perspective in Dewey's theory, he really looked at the different ages of children and how they learn things. So there's sensory motor, pre-operational, concrete operational, and formal operations. And in sensory motor, it's your children that are just being born to 2 years old. So you're about infant to almost toddler. But children don't have much of an understanding at this point, and they are actively exploring their environment. So they're touching things, they're moving things around, they're kind of messy. They like to transform the environment around them. They start to interiorize their actions and the things that are going on around them. And they start to discover object permanence. So they just start to discover that the objects, when they're there, they can touch them when they see them. From 2 to 6 years old is the pre-operational stage where where children start to form networks of their cognitive structures without physical structures in front of them. So just like the picture over here. But they don't really understand the difference of volume. So if you look at the picture on the right here, you have a graduated cylinder and you have a beaker. The child is expected to know that there's a difference in the water, even though they're watching this being done. But that doesn't necessarily happen at this age. So the next stage is concrete operational from 7 to 11 years old. Where students start to conceptualize the difference of that conserved volume. They start to understand that, oh, it is the same amount. It just kind of has to be measured out. And they can do that with a lot of experience. From 7 to 11 years old, children start to be able to do addition. They start to be able to add, subtract, and do division. They have the ability to start coming up with reasons when they're problem solving, or what I think of as a scientific method, and they're hypothesizing with reasons. They start to just kind of conceptualize their reasoning. So from 11 to 14 and 15 years old is the formal operations stage, where children and students start to develop the ability to think about abstract concepts. They are mentally able to predict things as well. And so Dewey was really concerned for the children's learning. He was concerned that we're teaching things that'll prepare students for the world, that they would continually be learning and growing in their knowledge. And as teachers, we should be observing what is in front of a child when they're learning, and how can that be made useful to a child's life? What can we do to explain this to a child, to connect it to something that is about them, that will help them remember? So how do we apply impulse to the developmental stages and make impulse useful in a child's learning? From experience. From our experience, and by looking at our students' experiences, kids are not just learning how to do something, but they are learning why something occurs and other implications as well. And in order for students to find interest in what we are teaching them, we need to first find what interests them. So that's, again, getting to know them. And we need to find that will help us find the rest of the balance in teaching them. I mean, there's always going to be a balance that we have to fill in, but Dewey argued in favor for this kind of curriculum. He felt like we needed to have a balanced curriculum, and that because teaching it's not about us, it's about the children and what they're learning. We need to allow them to also become more involved in what they're learning. So it's meeting their needs, finding out what helps the child, what are things that they can continue growing in knowledge with, that they can take with them and continue building upon, and how can we allow them to be involved in what is being taught to meet those interests and those needs. So there are different ways that we can help our students understand the world, and these will depend too on different levels of their age, but there are also different ways that we can allow children to be more involved in the classroom through these 6 concrete operations that were developed and believed in by Piaget. So the first one is transitivity, which is the idea of relation of properties. So in this first one here, you'll see in the image, it says if A equals B and B equals C, then A equals C. And the next one is seriation, which is the ability to order objects in respect of common property, which is something that I have seen teachers and even just parents kind of use with children as they're growing and developing and understanding. You're able to kind of test their knowledge and see where they're at. Classification, categorizing, and hierarchy. So an example that I had thought of with that is when you're in the library, the books are categorized by number, they're categorized by section. Um, Conservation, which is the ability to determine a certain quality, whether a certain quality will remain the same or not despite the adjustment of a container. So we had talked about this previously, and it's, can a child tell the difference in volume or can they not? So these different things will really help us understand what the development process is with our children as they're learning. It's not just about the learning, but seeing that development happen. The fifth one is reversibility, just understanding that our actions can be undone. They are not undone, but reversed. So like doing a push-up, working out, lifting weight, your arm goes back and forth. And then decentering, which is the ability to consider multiple aspects of situations and being able to just see multiple different perspectives of a situation. So, for example, we have the same kind of flower here, but there's different colors. And I think this is a good way to just kind of be able to bring unity into a classroom and show kids that it's okay. Like, we're all people, but we also may look different. We may have different personalities and traits. All right. So, as we see, our students learn through interactions with objects, interaction through emotion. We learn through reciprocity, empathy, in cooperation. We learn through interaction of learning how to make decisions, which is tied to equilibration. We learn through different beliefs that surround us, through hands-on interactions, concrete operations, through different impulses. And we also learn through lower and higher psychological functions, which Vygotsky believed in. Lower psychological functions were, for example, Skinner's work with the birds and the cat. And it was really the idea of a response to the stimulus, where higher psychological functions is the idea of using tools to help you reason, to help you understand situations. We also learn through social interactions and through group memberships, which are things that really shape our lives. Our students can be coming in with different experiences, different interactions, and at the same time, they're going to continue to be shaped by outside experiences of the classroom that we need to continue to meet. So group memberships are the idea of that social constructivism, that we all belong to, or not that we all belong to, that we may individually belong to, and it is something that will really shape to us whether something is right or not. It will shape our beliefs in society. In social interaction, we learn, it's really important because we learn these interactions through really observing our parents, who are our more knowledgeable other. They're our model figure, and we learn by copying what they're doing. So, for example, growing up, my siblings and I would play house downstairs, and my sister would be the mom, and my brother and I would pretend to be the babies. And so we learned to act like babies by observing babies. She learned to act like my mom and pretend she was cooking by watching my mom. And so we learned how do we act like a family by watching that more knowledgeable other that displayed this whole idea to family. A family for us. Our experiences are shaped also by the culture. So it's shaped by the culture we grow up in and the society that surrounds us, which is our family, is our friends, is our school, it may be a church if we're involved with a church, or some club. My parents were involved in a car club growing up, and so I was surrounded with going to car shows all the time and being surrounded by the impacts of those people and what they were bringing in. Um, and I think something that's really important to take away from this is that we are the more knowledgeable other over our children, as we'll be teaching. We'll be creating examples. We'll be giving them examples, modeling examples, teaching children what is the right or wrong way of doing something. Children are going to watch us more than we realize, which means as teachers, we need to be very, very careful, especially in our classrooms. We need to be careful of the actions, the words, the interactions we're displaying, um, because the last thing I think you're going to want is to even upset a family or disrespect somebody or disrespect their beliefs. We do not want to interact on our students' learning negatively either. And as students are coming to find themselves and their identities, as I've been learning in our 460 class, is we have to be careful in our words even for that. So to continue into learning about Vygotsky, he had something called the theory of general genetic development, which is the belief that everything we have learned through development it's a belief that we learn through development over time of all of our interactions, and that we continue learning until we have a full understanding of the world we live in, which I think is a life process. It's a continual process. But also this idea that we're learning from our more knowledgeable other, and yeah. So Vygotsky also believed in something called the practice or activity theory, which is something I've kind of explained already after introducing the interactions and groups, but it's this idea that whatever we're a part of will shape how we learn. It will shape what we believe. So he also believed in something called the zone of proximal development, which is the belief that belief that we talked about of every child learning from a more knowledgeable other, and he believed the amount of interaction determined the distance between the actual development level, which is determined by independent problem solving. And he also believed that potential development was determined through problem solving under guidance. So like problem solving with a teacher around the room, or a teacher by their side, or a parent by their side to help them. He believed that having that more knowledgeable other was very impactful and important. It was important to have that influence to be able to help that student better, to better reach their development levels for their age and their potential development. So to sum up Vygotsky's theory, we learn to understand how people know and learn needs to be accomplished through the developmental level, because we learn from other people. Everything we learn are generally from those who are older than us, teaching us about the world. We learn from mental processes that can only be understood if we're using tools or signs to help with that. If, for example, this semester had children learning how to raise their hand from a sign and from modeling in the classroom, which is also an example of learning from a more knowledgeable other. So, yeah, we're going to go into the final slide. So some of the implications that I think that we should take with us for teaching that I've really learned is that there's not one right way of doing things, and we need to allow our students to express themselves and make what they think publicly known. but we also are there to engage and help them as they're learning, as that more knowledgeable other who's teaching them. Students should be engaging in activities that are beyond what they can currently do on their own, but not to a point where it's so difficult that they can't do it. We all have situated learning groups and communities that we belong to, which can be either chosen for us at birth, it can be chosen on our own, or maybe imposed on us. We need to be careful with how we use our words because we do not know what other people's experiences or backgrounds are, and the groups we're involved in often determine and may expect things for our lives in the direction of how we're developing and establishing to establish members or mentors kind of in full participation of that group. All right, so that is about it for constructivism, and now we're going to move on to the last and final one. I apologize for how long this is. These PowerPoints are sometimes kind of hard for me to break down, and I guess that'll be something I have to work on as a teacher. So the next one we're talking about is cognitive science, which is just the focus on how we really process things. It's a study of thought on how we learn, mental organization, and really draws on psychology, linguistics, philosophy, and is compared to the computer model, how our brains are like this computer model. Yeah, so like I said, a big part of what I got from this is it's really about information processing and how can we help our students process this information, which I feel like we have talked a lot about so far with hands-on activities, by observing them psychologically, and just seeing all these interactions. I think they really kind of come together into this one. And so in our cognitive structures, as we're building on them, we really learn through representation, we learn through structure, and we learn through discipline. And structure and discipline I kind of see is very, very similar. So representation is just this idea that in order to understand something, you have to have something in front of you, like a physical object, for example. So this goes back to what Dewey kind of had thought and how he felt like we needed to have manipulatives in front of us. Representations will make us think of children and be able to observe their learning. We'll be able to help them learn as well. And so there's two different kinds of representation, which are physical representation and then cognitive or abstract representation. And physical representation is just kind of hands-on learning using manipulatives, or is a visual to learn. So posters around school, encouragement around the school. And I know that one that I saw as a child was a poster of a cat, and it had always said "Dream Big," and they had that up in our library. Cognitive abstract representations are things like writing ideas on paper. Is not necessarily having hands-on objects to draw back to prior knowledge and being able to do things, but it's allowing students to have time to write about like whatever they would like to, for example. Structure is this idea that there are rules or discipline in how we do things. And that more so is talking about subject and how we are supposed to do subject. So for example, math, I love math, but we have to follow specific equations and different ways to break down problems as we are doing them. And those are rules that we're taught. those are the disciplines of what we're taught. And so discipline is really just showing whether we want to follow that or not. It's that willingness to obey and listen to those rules and follow them. But as teachers, we have to observe our students and seeing, are they following the structure? Are they following the discipline? And we're to judge how well they're doing at something, and see how we can take those and better help them. So there are two different kinds of structure, and there are two different kinds of discipline that I would like to talk about. The first two for structure, there's substantive structure, which is this whole idea of a record of knowledge that is being displayed. So if you're a part of a group or church, you're going to most likely believe everything or most of what they are teaching you. I know that is how it has been for me growing up until I made that choice. And then there's syntactic structure and how we can create new knowledge. So this is the idea that we are using a set of rules to create that knowledge in academic discipline. And then for discipline, there's mental and formal discipline. So mental discipline was just this idea that your mind's like a muscle, and the more that you, I think of working out, the more you work it, the more you build it up, the stronger that it'll be. And formal discipline is just, again, the discipline of the different subjects. So representation, structure, and discipline play different areas in how we learn and how our future students are going to learn. These three things help us to put what we are learning into the work we are doing and our students are doing. And it also kind of makes you think back to how we learned as children and how we still do today. Once these things are learned, we continue to use them. We continue to use that prior knowledge of the tools that we learned for something else, which is transfer. It's taking something we learned and using it somewhere else. But we also take that prior knowledge and we have this mental map, I guess you could say, which is like a visual of what you've learned, where you're kind of going and you're picking out where this is at in your brain, where has it been kind of filed. So an example of a mental map is that as teachers, we have this like visual map of how our classroom is set up, or where each thing's are at, or where our students are at. But also, when planning a lesson, we need to be able to visualize and draw on that mental map for our students to say, okay, this student needs this student needs this. How can we put this together for them? Another example that I kind of saw for a mental map was how our prior knowledge is being added to that. So transfer is prior knowledge. It's what our mental map consists of. And there are three different kinds of transfer. There's horizontal, vertical, and lateral. Horizontal is when you have two similar structures that are different. So if you look at the visual that I have here, you have sentence 1 and sentence 2. They're similar structures, they're similar setup, but they're different. And the second one is vertical transfer, which is the idea that as you learn and gain more knowledge, learning is going to get harder and harder. So we start with children learning the alphabet to them eventually learning how to read words or write a paper. It gets harder and harder. And the lateral transfer is just the idea that we're teaching students lessons in which they have learned new skills and they will take those skills and apply them to this lesson. My last slide. So some ways that we can help our students build up these cognitive structures and continue building them are through advanced organizers which is like a planner explaining to the students what is going to be going on for the day to give them an idea how they can mentally prepare themselves, or through anchoring ideas, which is tying our ideas or prior knowledge to something new that we are learning, to better help us understand how to learn those things. And then lastly, I just kind of want to talk about how we learn. Our learning is like a computer. Our brains are in a way very similar to a computer in the fact that we have to process information, and this is something that has been found to be very similar by psychologists. But yeah, when we receive information, we have to process that information. Of course, there are ways that we are both like computers or not, but some ways that we are like it are that we have to take in information, and which is also called input for a computer. We have to make decisions about what we're going to do with the information and how we're going to store it. How are we going to remember it? What are we going to do with that information then once we do remember it? And the computer model just kind of helps us as teachers observe our students and try to understand and figure out what they are learning. Like computers, ourselves and children will store and remember things that are being learned by a topic or subjects, like if we're talking about animals. And this is something that really taught me that we need to be specific and we need to be careful about how we're wording things in our lessons, and we need to really clarify in that, to really help students to know where to pull information from. Like, because all students are going to have different experiences, we have to do this. We have to try to come to their understanding. How can this model help us help our students? We're going to have all sorts of students that will be gifted and better in some areas or subjects than others, even talented in areas. But we need to make sure that we're allowing them to be able to use that gift, and to figure out how to practice and problem solve in different areas. By doing this and teaching them different strategies, we'll give them different things that they can use when it gets to a situation. They're going to say, okay, well, how can I do this? What can I do with this? So we need to be careful about how much information we're giving to our students at once, or we can make them frustrated or become overloaded. We can only hold so much information if we want them to remember what we're teaching. Then we need to teach them a little bit at a time. We need to teach our students in steps about how to do something. We cannot just expect them to know how to do that without being taught. We need to be clear in our instruction and our directions for our students if we want to help them fully understand. But we also need to be careful with the choices of words we choose to say. So, for example, depending on what age or grade level we're working with, they'll know more words than others. And if you throw words at a first grader that they're not ready to learn or receive, they're not going to understand what you're trying to teach them. If students don't understand it, it's also not because they don't know it, or not because they're not listening, but that might just mean that as teachers we have to find different ways to come and help them. And by doing this, by teaching them and coming to them with their interests, we can motivate them, and we can implement motivation into our teaching. We just need to remember if our students are struggling, again, like I said, it doesn't mean they're not trying and they don't want to learn. We as teachers, it's our job to help them figure that out, to figure out how can we get this little computer brain to work. We can help our students by allowing them to express creativity in school projects, art time, or even in individual lessons we're teaching. We can and we can meet the needs of our students by helping them learn through the funds of knowledge and seeing where they're coming from, finding what their interests are, and really trying to just place ourselves in their shoes. Overall, what we're teaching them is just a broad education and how we can prepare them for everything that they're going to be doing in life. But yeah, that is my presentation. Sorry that it was so long. I even broke it down about halfway. So thank you and have a good day.